Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to Soccer Made in Portland. It is Tuesday, and it's January 10th, and we're very happy to be back on the North American Soccer Network. I'm Mao speaking, and you can see Kelly McLean with his shirt sponsor of Nike over there on the other side. How are you doing, Kelly?
Quite well, and no, we are not sponsored by Nike.
I just didn't know if you were personally sponsored by Nike. I didn't know
Well,
if I
I
was
mean,
missing
I
out on
am
some kind of a
personally,
deal.
of course, but yeah, not the show.
Oh, okay, fair enough. We'll have to work on that. Well, welcome back. Let me get a few contact details out of the way so you know how to get in touch with us when we're not on the show. Or you can do it while we're on the show as well. You can send us in messages into the chat box of our show, and we'll try to get to those if they're questions or comments or what have you. Twitter is also a good way. We're at SoccerMadeInPDX. And you can send us emails at soccer.portland@gmail.com. And of course, all of our archived shows are on the NASN website. That's nasn.tv. And we're on iTunes, both audio and video podcasts. We recommend you download both of those if you want, or subscribe, I should say, to both of those if you want them to download as soon as they're up and ready. So that's a good way to keep up instead of, you're welcome to ask when it'll be up. Usually I know it's up when I get it downloaded into my iTunes myself. So that's the best way to get the newest episodes as soon as possible. And of course, we're always happy to hear any suggestions or questions or recommended guests or recommended topics or anything like that. Just let us know in one way or another, and we will try to take care of that. Very quickly, because we have a lot to cover. Last week, we're not going to have a guest today. Last week, we had a guest, Merritt Paulson, which was fantastic, and we appreciate that again for him giving us some time. Little does he know that he's actually our de facto guest today. He has provided much of the material that we will be doing for this particular show, and so we'll get to that in a minute. But let me just say, January 10th, 1982, that would be 30 years ago today. This is another Timbers indoor score. We are, I promise, getting closer to non-indoor score dates in Timbers history. For example, on the 13th, we just have bad luck and bad timing with what day we end up having the show. Because, for example, January 13th of last year is the SuperDraft day. So we could talk about that being Darlington Nagbe. That's also the day the Timbers announced signing Kenny Cooper. So it just so happened that Tuesday did not fall on the 13th of January this year. So eventually we'll get some other stuff. But on January 10th, 1982, the Timbers lost to the San Jose Earthquake 7-6 in indoor. This is a common refrain. You've heard 3 goals from Stuart Lee, 1 from Willie Anderson, 1 from John Bain, 1 from Dale Mitchell. Pretty much the 4 best indoor players the Timbers had at that time. We have, I wouldn't say breaking news, but a little bit of an interesting note. We have to give Sherry Lynn some credit. She's at Sheba in PDX on Twitter, and she is the local expert in following Colombian media folk. And she retweeted a message just literally minutes before we started here. Basically from a guy who seems to be a radio host in Colombia, Guillermo Arango. And the tweet basically said that Jorge Perlaza has been claimed by Independiente, the Argentine club that was, of course, in Portland in 2011 for a friendly, that he, Perlaza, along with Dairo Moreno, who's a pretty well-known Colombian striker as well, that they were both claimed by Independiente. Now that, of course, immediately begs the question, what does claimed mean? Is that does that mean a transfer of some kind? Does it mean a loan of some kind? Is it simply a case of his rights being transferred, even though he may not actually leave the team? What does that mean? Of course, there's nothing yet out there from the Timbers or otherwise. But yeah, there's a couple of interesting possibilities if that's true.
Yeah, and I think, I suppose the reason something like this, if it were just rumors or speculation or whatever it is, something like this can kind of get legs because of the Timbers' situation along the forward line with the strikers, which is they've got a ton of them. And if the rumors start up that one of them is perhaps moving away, obviously it's going to gain traction because if you include Nagbe, the Timbers have 7 strikers on the roster, which, is obviously more than they need. They've got a couple of young guys that they're, hoping will develop. So it wouldn't be a big shock at all, to hear that, I suppose that any of them, but Perlaza, certainly he comes with an international spot. If he were to move on, then that would free up an international spot, which the Timbers are, they're in a prickly spot when it comes to international slots right now. So who knows? There could be some truth to it. It could just be the old rumor mill and speculation, and why not, Perlaza going someplace else?
Yeah, and we're certainly not suggesting that it is definitely true, but it is a little bit of an intriguing idea. And frankly, of all the players, I guess the only other one that would make sense in a move that would be open things up on multiple fronts would be Eddie Johnson, because of his he also carries an international tag, unless he is one of the rumored visa recipients. We're still in the dark on that one. Hopefully that'll be clarified sooner rather than later. But yeah, Perlaza, I think it's interesting too, because I think we've heard from the club, from Merritt in particular, not necessarily when he was on with us last week, but in previous statements and such, that they've always referred to both Diego and Jorge as players who would be helpful for helping Trencito, acclimate to a new country, a new league, being, from the same country, would be sort of assumed that would be helpful. And in almost every circumstance, I think Jorge's been included in that, in that statement. So maybe that's just to cover their tracks. Maybe it's not to lead anybody to thinking, well, why didn't they mention Jorge when they mentioned Diego? Or maybe it means that he's not moving. I don't know, but it's something to keep an eye on. We were talking about this just before we came on. When friendlies happen, they're not random. There's not it's not like the Timbers just threw a line out there and the best they could come up with was Independiente. There's a specific reason, and part of that was they had Kelly, you probably remember this, and others who were there or watching probably remember too. At the end of the game, both Diego and Jorge were chatting with a player, and I don't recall the player's name now, but they had all played together at a previous club in Colombia. And, so there are some connections that were already there. And then, of course, we heard things last year about, well, maybe West Brom, when they came in, they were thinking of possibly loaning a player to the Timbers. Similar things with Ajax. We have to assume it's at least entered the discussion or in the mind of those involved in organizing this preseason tournament this year with AIK. These things aren't random, that they are done for a reason. So, that the rumor is with a club who was here over the summer makes it more likely to be true in my mind, or at least more worthy of consideration than if it was, oh, well, Jorge Perlaza is going to sign with, Genoa, or just something completely, random. That this holds a little more weight for me anyway.
Sure. But, it is important to remember it is just a rumor, and we don't know, exactly who it is that this is coming from. All we can look at really is a Twitter feed. But interesting, it does bring up the conversations, at least, about the number of strikers on the roster, the number of international spots. It definitely brings up, some of those other interesting scenarios and questions that are probably having to be dealt with by the Timbers here in the near future.
Yeah, and one we should say, actually, we're going to kind of bounce around a little bit today just because of the nature of what we've gleaned from Twitter on the one hand, but then also just some different bits of news finally, now that it's January. A couple of things, not all good necessarily, but interesting nonetheless. And we should mention that one of those 7 forwards is Brent Richards. And this is the guy we talked a little bit about last week. We specifically didn't put Merritt on the spot to try and answer any questions about that. I'm pretty sure it was pretty much the next day that they announced, true to form, that they announced him as the Timbers' first homegrown player. By this point, most folks listening are, who are followers of the Timbers will certainly be aware of this having happened. But to add another forward, compounds the issue of, how many players do you need at a position? It's not, that right now the Timbers have 3 center backs for 2 starting positions. The Timbers have 7 forwards for 2 starting positions. So, I think everyone would agree the Timbers are pretty thin at center back. But the addition of Brent Richards, he's obviously younger than a guy like Jorge Perlaza or Eddie Johnson for that matter, or Bright DK for that matter. And yeah, so let's talk a little bit about how that went down, and maybe more about the explanation of how it went down, or kind of how it was allowed to happen, because I think that's even more significant than the actual addition of Brent Richards to the 2012 Timbers.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we'd talked before on the show about some of the confusion with the homegrown player signings and some of the guidelines and how we don't know necessarily all of the details for signing a homegrown player. And then, of course, there were a lot of questions about how Brent Richards could be included with Portland and how they could sign him as a homegrown. And I mean, before we get into it too much, there was a wonderful article from Kyle McCarthy, and maybe we can tweet that out later on if you haven't seen it. But he actually got, I think, with all this homegrown player stuff, he did a little investigating, and he talked to Todd Durbin, who's in the MLS. He's one of the vice presidents, deals with competition, players, and that sort of thing. And so he got some clarification on some things. It's a really good article. Not only does he talk about some of the elements of the homegrown player status, but he also looks at a couple of the recent cases of homegrown signings and where some fans sort of had some issues with them, and sort of breaks them down and gives sort of the different considerations for those things. It's a really good article. You really need to go and read that if you haven't already. But one of the ones he talks about is Portland signing Brent Richards, and it wasn't until the announcement actually came out that I think it was sort of widespread information that Brent had played for Eastside United, and that there was a deal in place when Portland was awarded their MLS franchise that they could claim Eastside as their developmental program. And so since Brent had played there, that he was included within that. And I don't think all of that is information that we really knew going into that signing, which is something that sort of led to all of those questions. And I know there were people who also, I saw a lot on Twitter and Facebook and whatnot that people in Seattle were upset, but Seattle didn't have any claim to him as a homegrown player either. I mean, I think it was really between him being a Portland homegrown player or entering the draft. That Seattle, even though he played up at Washington, they didn't really have any claim to him at all. But I think people were confused about how Portland had that claim, and there were definitely some pieces of information that we just simply didn't know about him playing at Eastside and the agreement with the Timbers and the MLS about Eastside sort of being their sort of pre-MLS academy, if you will.
Yeah, and it sounds like it was basically arranged that way to give the Timbers a little bit of help in competing with Vancouver as a fellow MLS entrant, because Vancouver, as everybody knows, has a really long standing and well-established and pretty well-functioning residency program.
Right.
And so they've been able to already sign homegrown players in the manner of which one might expect. This kid went through the residency program or has been playing with the Vancouver Whitecaps since he was 13 or whatever the case is. So It's a little bit funny. I did see some stuff from Seattle, people saying, you know what, this actually makes me happy that the Timbers are able to make this signing, because it basically means they're so pathetic that the league had to create an exception just to help them out. And in a lot of ways, that's the reason, basically, that nobody could make any sense of this before this information came out, because it doesn't fit into the rules as written. It is very clearly an exception that was written into, as you said, the sort of the MLS expansion agreement or contract or whatever you want to call it. When Portland was awarded a club, they basically negotiated to have Eastside, and the connection is that Gavin Wilkinson, I think, started Eastside United.
I think so.
And certainly has run the club for a long time. I seriously doubt he's as involved now as he was in the past.
Right.
But the fact remains that he's basically on the staff of both. Jim Rylat is on the staff of both. He's the Timbers under-23 coach. He, you'll see him at practice and at games. Even with the first team, he sits on the sideline, and he works over at Eastside as well. So that there are legitimate ties, and they've obviously made this deal, but they kept it quiet, and I understand why they kept it quiet. On one hand, but it now begs the question: who else fits into this exemption? There's no way this is going to continue. There's only a certain number of guys who could possibly fit under this, because the Timbers are now developing their actual academy. So in the future, homegrown players won't have to be claimed to Eastside United. Eastside is now basically part of the Timbers developmental academy, and so that won't be an exemption or an exception anymore down the line. But there are some other guys who kind of are in the age range where they're in college now. They played at Eastside as in junior high and high school, and could conceivably be sort of under the Brent Richards rule, if you will. Different guys have different levels of commitment, or they've been involved with Eastside at different levels, or with the Timbers at different levels. I think one guy who would fit perfectly into this, I don't know, and I'm not saying the Timbers will make this a homegrown signing, but Stephen Evans is a player at University of Portland, and he's unlike Brent Richards, who is not from Portland, went to college somewhere else, went to high school somewhere else, all these things. Stephen Evans has all of the sort of qualification. He's from Portland. He went to Central Catholic High School. He's at the University of Portland now. He played at Eastside, basically growing up. So he's kind of claimable on all the regular levels once it's understood that, okay, if you played at Eastside during this period of time, you're acceptable by MLS at this point.
Well, here's my question, though. Now, so the Timbers have overtaken the ODP program, and they are turning that into their ODP / academy program. Is Eastside still going to be technically, under their umbrella? If a kid is at Eastside and they, for instance, I guess, couldn't convince him to come and be part of the Timbers training program. Say you had a kid who didn't want to commit to the Timbers program, not play for their high school. So maybe he was a two-sport athlete. Maybe he plays soccer for Eastside, all year round, but he's also a basketball player. So he plays high school and basketball, soccer and basketball at his high school, plays for Eastside, goes on to college, but he's a really good player. Maybe he goes to UP or whatever. Can the Timbers still claim him then as a homegrown? Does Eastside still fit into that? And if so, if he does, what would keep a club from, say, taking Amos McGee, putting him on the board, or giving him a title at FC Portland or Lake Oswego or any other club, and then claiming that club is also under part of your developmental program? I just sort of wonder where that line gets drawn. And then in Kyle McCarthy's article, it basically, I mean, I should go and reread it, and maybe you can help clarify a little bit, but he almost made it sound like, I think Philadelphia, he pointed out, he almost made it sound like that's the way their academy is it's just all of these surrounding local clubs that they somehow have a claim to. And if any of those kids ends up being somebody they want, then they can claim them.
Yeah.
I don't know. It seems like a whole can of worms is getting opened up here. I don't know.
I agree. Yeah. It seems that it's going to be on a case by case basis that MLS is, and this is where a lot of frustration has come out, in particular with people in Seattle, because they, like Portland, did not have an academy when they started in MLS. And as far as I know, without being an expert on Seattle's youth program, didn't get to benefit in the same way the Timbers are going to benefit, or Philadelphia benefited from sort of the tweaking of the rules. And part of that has been a change in emphasis on the part of the league to encourage youth development. Part of that has gone in with the U20, the youth designated players. Then there's also sort of the expansion of the homegrown rule to not be limited in any particular. I mean, you can have an unlimited number of homegrown players in any given year sign with the team, whereas I think before it was limited to some number. All of that has kind of happened in the last 2 years. So I get the frustration on the part of Seattle saying, well, or Seattle fans, that's not really fair that this has happened. But yeah, it opens a lot of questions about sort of, there's always kind of suggestions that MLS favors different teams, or in a specific case or a specific instance, that they'll just change a rule and then change it back or change it permanently based on the circumstances to allow or disallow one particular thing to happen. And it sounds like that's the case here. There's no indication that Montreal is getting a similar treatment. Whenever there's a 20th MLS team, which there will be one day, are they going to automatically be able? I mean, like if you're Orlando, Orlando City or some other group that's putting together a package, isn't the first thing you're doing making sure that the people involved in your club, like you said, are involved in some level with youth academies or youth programs around town? Because then you can just say, well,
yeah,
look, you did it in Portland. You grandfathered these things in, to use a bad term, and you have to do the same for me, because look, from 3 years before we knew we were getting an MLS team, we've had X, Y, and Z people in X, Y, and Z places. So it kind of sounds like we're bashing Portland here a little bit, but I think we're really bashing MLS for being ambiguous and sort of just making decisions on a whim. Even if it's good for the long term of the entire league, I think everybody would be better served in some ways by having a little bit more consistency, or at least an explanation from the league, and not requiring. I mean, all the articles that we have seen are quoting Merritt Paulson's tweets.
Right.
That's the information that, not all of the information. As you said, Kyle McCarthy went to MLS about this stuff, but even still, he was quoting what Merritt was saying that we were talking about a couple of weeks ago.
Right.
Because that's the information that's out there, and that's good for Portland fans because it means we're getting more information than maybe other clubs are getting from their front offices. But that's not good for the league in general when you're having serious beat writer. I mean, Kyle McCarthy is the beat writer for the New England Revolution, and then also does Goal.com and other stuff, league wide stuff. He's one of the sort of heavy hitters in terms of MLS regular writers, and the fact that he's quoting tweets, as evidence to support an idea, that's not necessarily what MLS wants.
Right, and. Also in his article, with his quote from the MLS, from Durban, there was a quote in there that he sort of said that they are tweaking things as they go. And he just admitted that they are kind of massaging things a little bit as they go, and a lot of these are case by case basis. And I think it's just a situation where the league came up with an idea that was a good idea, and before they really spell checked the whole thing, they just took their rough draft and said, let's go with it. And they didn't really consider, well, what about this scenario? And what if this scenario happens? And so now I think they're kind of trying to scramble a little bit to define some things when they perhaps maybe didn't consider all of the possibilities that could happen. Maybe they just implemented it a little bit too fast because it was such a good idea. And one of the goals is to keep these good young American players here and playing, instead of perhaps maybe jumping at an early age, over to Europe or something, trying to give them incentives to stay here, which is a good idea and it's good for the league. But yeah, when you do things on a case-by-case basis, when you don't have all the rules and guidelines set in stone and published for people to see, it's just going to create confusion. And it doesn't necessarily mean that anything's wrong or bad or broken. But, when you don't have kind of that transparency, it just leads to a lot of confusion. And so people don't know what are the guidelines, what are the rules, how are some of these things being done.
Definitely. Well, let's mention something else that came out yesterday, and this also caused a bit of confusion on Twitter. I guess we'll go to the Merritt Paulson Twitter part of it after just saying the news. David Horst is going to be out for what the Timbers are claiming will be 5 to 7 months with what was described as a successful hip surgery. As I saw somebody say, has there ever been an unsuccessful surgery that has been announced by a team? No, of course not. You would never, if something went wrong, you would never announce it. You would just wait until it had been corrected. So anyway, torn labrum and another phrase that I'm not even going to try to pronounce in his left hip. And so we'll go to the Merritt Paulson Twitter here, and basically Merritt said that we know David Horst had a number of issues last year injury-wise, groin issues, ankle issues, I think shoulder maybe as well. He had some difficulty staying in the lineup, not necessarily due to poor performance, but due to injuries. And so Merritt said Horst battled issues all last season, and we were aware of his condition when we re-signed him. Because remember, David Horst was not a guy for whom they picked up an option. He was a guy that only had a 1-year contract, did not have a 1 year plus an option for another or anything like that. And so he had to be re-signed. And clearly the team knew about this ahead of time. And then I guess where the confusion set in is as Merritt was conversing with several people who were wondering if basically the question that came time and again was, if you knew about this condition, why did he wait to have the surgery until now? Why wouldn't he have it in October or November when part of, 2 or 3 of those 5 to 7 months could have been used in the off season instead of, well, I mean, it's still the off season, but instead of dipping so much into the regular season? And his answer was, yeah, he had surgery several weeks ago. It was just announced yesterday. Unclear if it was necessary or not for a bit. And a bunch of people had some issues with that statement. My understanding was that of that statement was that it was unclear that Horst needed surgery, not that it was unclear whether or not he had an injury. And it seems like either something happened between the end of the season and 3 weeks ago that required a surgery, something specific, or whatever kind of rehab he was doing and resting that he was doing simply wasn't enough, that they determined, you know what, it would just be better instead of trying to go back out there and start training camp and hope that it doesn't get worse, that just having surgery will ultimately fix the problem. And when you come back, you won't have to worry about it at all.
Right.
So regardless, David Horst, who I think started 11 games in 2011 and I think played in 16, was certainly a significant contributor, both in his own right and as a replacement for Footy Danso on a number of occasions, and Eric Brunner actually a couple times. He's going to be out for at least half the season, assuming he doesn't have a miracle Bright DK recovery.
Right, and that to me, it's a huge blow. I sort of thought that he was probably a little bit better than Footy most of the time when he was in there. Just me personally, my opinion, I liked him just a touch better when he was out there. But he battled some little injuries all year long that really didn't allow him to get that good consistency. But I mean, clearly this is a huge blow because, as you mentioned earlier, they've got 3 center backs. And if you want to count Purdy, who's kind of, maybe they see him as a dual sort of center back, right back, at most they've got 4 with him out.
And they never used him as a center back last year.
And they never used him as a center back other than reserve games. We're talking about Purdy. So, I mean, if, when you're looking at guys who actually saw first team minutes at the center back position, this time last year, everybody thought that the Timbers looked golden. They had 4 guys. They had experience. They had youth. They had size. They had everything. Obviously, Goldthwait didn't play as well as we would have liked, and then he was injured. Now Horst out, and you're down to 2 guys now who saw minutes at that center back spot. So that's really something now that is a big concern and needs to be addressed. And I don't know if it's great. I mean, we don't know what Gavin's plans are for the whole, roster in the off season, but you have to wonder now if that, forces him to tweak some things a little bit. Now, maybe not today, but maybe a couple of weeks ago when they decided, all right, let's have Horst do this surgery. Did they have to kind of tweak their plan a little bit and maybe look to use some of their resources in a position where they weren't necessarily originally planning to?
Yeah, there's a couple of ways to go from here. And let's start with Jeffrey Arnold, who has reported, I think, 3 times from the Combine now, at least twice, saying that the Timbers are focusing their efforts on center defenders, center backs, in the draft, that's who they're keen on in the Combine to look to potentially draft. Now, he listed in different times about 6 different players, one of which is completely unreachable if there's not a trade, which is the Duke, the Herman Trophy Award winner, Andrew Winger. I think I think if the Timbers were drafting at number 2, they would probably just draft Andrew Winger because he seems to be a really good option. But he's not going to be there at 8. That's
right.
Absolutely certain. So there's that to consider. Then, so the reporting, the only reporting there is, because there's nobody else get in contact with the Timbers while they're at the Combine. The only reporting is the Timbers are focusing on center backs for the draft, or could possibly trade. Then Merritt Paulson yesterday says the draft and the Combine are not the defensive answer. We have plenty of high potential youth already. Okay, so there's that, which I'm not exactly sure what that means. I can conceivably, I can refer to Rodney Wallace as high potential youth. I can refer to Chris Taylor as potential youth. I don't know that he is on the level that we would say he's high potential at this point. Maybe he is, and we don't know yet. But, from what we saw, he looked pretty solid in the reserves, but certainly not spectacular. He never broke the 18, let alone play a minute. So that has to be at least a factor. None of the other defenders are young by any stretch of the imagination.
The only thing you could do is if you really wanted to stretch and throw Freddie Braun in there, because he's done
He
some
played
stuff.
right
So
back in the reserves. Yeah.
right. So, I mean, if you want to stretch it, I mean, again, if we want to stretch it as far as we can, we're looking at most 3 guys. And I don't know, it's a bit generous to call them all high potential youth.
Yeah. And yeah. So then later yesterday, the 9th, Merritt said, fair to expect a couple of significant international defensive signings. So then one has to consider, well, maybe he, by saying high potential youth, he's referring to as yet unannounced younger high potential defenders, which of course we can't comment upon because we don't,
Right.
we don't know who that could be. We do know the Timbers have been linked with a Colombian defender named Javier Mosquera. He played with Diego Chara in 2008 at Deportes Quindío. He recently played at La Equidad in Colombia, not at Millonarios, which a lot of people are incorrectly saying that he is coming to the Timbers from this club. The case is that they offered him a deal. He basically had a deal in place, and then at the last minute changed his mind because he got what he considered a better deal from Portland. That's the article that's out there. So that's a possibility. He turns 25 next week on the 15th, and he's a center back. So that's a possibility. But I also don't necessarily know that a 25-year-old defender is a high potential youth classification. I guess it just depends on what you define as youth. I mean, we've heard Merritt Paulson and others refer to Bright DK as a young player, and Bright DK is not a young player relative to, say, Trencito, who you would definitely refer to as a young player. So defense is definitely now, and Merritt told us this last week as well, that defense is an area they're going to focus, where they're going to have a focus. What doesn't make any sense to me, and maybe this is for trade possibilities in the future, but the Timbers retained the following players at the end of the season. Now, that you remember, we mentioned they declined the option on a number of players. These are players whose options were not declined: Chris Taylor, Rodney Wallace, Mike Chabala, Steve Purdy, Lavelle Palmer, Eric Bruner, David Horst, Footy Dansu. That sounds like 8, I think, players in my mind. And as you said, you could, if you want, throw Freddie Braun in there as well. I think for now, it's probably worth just keeping him as a midfielder in this discussion. But the Timbers brought back 8 defenders from a defense that, while admittedly much better in the second half of the season than in the first, was one of the major question marks of the team. So to say that there's a focus on bringing in defenders, it's just curious to me that didn't begin with getting rid of some defenders to open up some of those roster spots and then bringing more in to replace them. I mean, Goldthwait is the only defender who doesn't come back, and that's because he was basically too injured too often and retired. So it's clear that is a need. What's unclear is the method by which that need is going to be met. It seems the draft is not going to be the answer. For my money, anyway, there's nobody at number 8 worth picking who's a defender. It seems the best defender is too good to be available at 8, and the rest of the better defenders are not good enough to draft at 8. The Timbers are, because there are 9 generation Adidas players, and the Timbers being in the 8th slot, it's guaranteed that at least 2 players will still be available who have generation Adidas contracts. So that pick is very valuable. The Timbers, and you and I were talking about this yesterday, the Timbers had the lowest payroll in MLS in 2011. And we don't know exactly what it was, but we know it was less than everyone else and well below the salary cap. We have to assume they're going to be much closer to the salary cap this year, given the signings they've already made. But that slot, that generation Adidas slot, holds a lot of value for other teams that are already over the salary cap, much closer to it. That may be a way the Timbers can either acquire a defender via trade, an existing MLS defender, or perhaps acquire allocation money in an international spot, which would, ease the signing of someone that they may already have lined up or may not yet have lined up. So there's going to be something that happens on Thursday at the draft that may have nothing to do with the draft, that where the Timbers are going to increase the number of players on the roster and increase the number of defenders. The question is, are they going to ship someone out as part of a deal? You can have the number 8 pick and this player for allocation money and a player, or I don't know, but they're going to have to do something there.
Yeah, and as far as keeping all of those defenders, they're kind of in a prickly spot because, you can't just take, 6 guys and release them in the hopes that you're going to sign a bunch of defenders. So, they're kind of stuck there. They're probably trying to balance keeping some defenders and at the same time bringing in a couple of quality pieces. And once those deals are done and they know they've got a couple of guys they can bring in, maybe then we will see some movement with a couple of those other defenders, like you mentioned, maybe packaged in on a draft day deal, something like that. But Merritt did also tweet out that his prediction is lots of wheeling and dealing on draft day. And I think I'm sort of the same mind as you. It doesn't at this point seem like they're going to use that 8th pick to just sit there and select a player in that spot. It definitely seems more like they're going to use that as some leverage to get some allocation money, some more international spots, to maybe bring in some overseas player. But like last year, sometimes you never know who can fall to you, unexpectedly. Certainly, Nagby fell to them and they weren't necessarily expecting that to happen. You never know. There's that other center back, the Jean Baptista. Is that how you say it, I think? Is something of that nature. And apparently, he's looked pretty good. I've read his name from a couple of different sources. There's a chance, supposedly, that he might be able to fall to that 8th spot. So maybe they kind of wait and see. Maybe they have some deals lined up, and they sort of are patient to see if one of those guys does fall to them at number 8, then maybe they just take him. Or if that doesn't happen, they execute some moves that maybe they've talked about ahead of time with some clubs. But it certainly is interesting, and certainly the Horst injury adds to the whole complexity of everything. But I would expect to see a few more signings from international signings, or some trades within the league in that defender position, or maybe if they're lucky, one of those guys falls to them and they maybe take one of those young defenders in the draft.
Yeah, but as you said before, they're going to have to do something regarding international slots. They're either going to have to gain them via trade, or they're going to have to make trades to get rid of existing players who have those designations, simply to free spaces up, because all we keep hearing is that there are going to be more international signings, and it is impossible at the present time. That's probably why they're not being announced. Or if they're not finalized, because they have to work this out. And now we've heard there are going to be 2 players that get visas that didn't have them, that didn't count as American players last year. I mean, I think everybody assumes that Darlington Nagbe is the prime candidate for one of those. Who another could be, I don't know. Eddie Johnson could be one. Footy Dansu could be one. I mean, he's been in the U.S. for more than 5 years now, or 5 years now, if you go back to when he was in college, and things like that. So as always, there's a lot under the top layer. David Horst is only a topic of conversation on this show today because the club decided to make it public yesterday, not 3 weeks ago when he actually had the surgery. So they have, of course, a head start on us. I mean, they've known about this, and they've been able to whether it's get in contact with agents, start talking trades with other teams. They've had this knowledge for a while that they're not going to have David Horst as a backup or a starter, whatever the case was going to be. He's just not going to be around for a while. And it stinks for David. They obviously have confidence that he's good enough and that the surgeries will correct the problem because they re-signed him knowing that this was an issue. I do wonder if he had to have surgery in October, if it was deemed bad enough at that time and necessary to have surgery, whether or not David Horst would be on this roster. Because at the time that they re-signed him, I guess in early to mid-December, he had, I guess it was assumed that he didn't need surgery, which is why he didn't have it. So yeah, it's interesting. I think we're going to see the Timbers made a couple of trades last year, on the draft day. Part of that was because they got Nagbe and they needed an international spot because of that, and they made some deals. But we're going to see a busy day on Thursday, and we're going to have a lot to talk about next week regardless. I do want to make sure we talk about the schedule because that also has come out since our last show.
Right.
I think everybody's seen it by now and knows the highlights, but I do kind of want to talk about a couple of weird things. The first is, of course, the Cascadia Cup, and we don't need to spend too much time on it because everybody's been talking about it, but Portland hosts Seattle and Vancouver twice. Yeah. Which is good in some ways, bad in other ways, and basically has generally made everyone angry. Not everyone outside of Portland angry that is the case. There's going to have to be some finagling in terms of awarding the Cascadia Cup because it's certainly not at balance in terms of home games. Wouldn't be the first time that's been the case in the history of the Cascadia Cup, but nonetheless, that is there. But what intrigued me more is by having those two teams at home twice, they are two of the teams, for which the Timbers will not have two away games. The Timbers' two away games, Dallas, Colorado, LA Galaxy, and Salt Lake. Let me remind everybody how the Timbers did in those games last year. At Salt Lake was the best result, a 1-1 draw in the last game of the season, in a game that basically didn't matter for either team. Footy Dance, who got the injury time equalizer in that one. So that 1-1 draw at Salt Lake, that's a good result regardless of circumstances. At Dallas, 4-0 loss, probably the worst game of the Timbers' entire season. At Colorado, 3-1 loss. Admittedly, opening game of the season, those were not good circumstances, but still, that was a terrible game for the most part from the Timbers. And at the Galaxy, 3-0 loss in April. And that, before the Dallas game, was probably the worst the Timbers looked all season. I'm not suggesting that the Timbers cannot do better than they did. In most cases, they cannot do worse than what they did in those games last year. But that is 1 point from 12 that the Timbers got last year in those games. And now they're going to have 24 possible points against those four teams. And that is going to take a significant portion of their Western Conference points. I mean, that is really difficult. I mean, I would much rather have two away games against Vancouver where there's an expectation that they may not be as good as the Galaxy or Dallas or Salt Lake or Colorado for that matter. I would almost rather have two away games against Seattle because it's a stupid cliche, but it is true. It doesn't really matter how good Seattle and Portland are relative to each other. The chances are those are going to be close, tight games. Right. There's a better chance of the Timbers getting a point against Seattle because of the rivalry and because of the intensity than there is at the Galaxy. So this sets up a really difficult season, I think, in a lot of ways. And then the other thing that's going to be tough is that only 3 of the final 8 games of the season are at home. The Timbers only play 3 games at home in the months of September and October. Those games are Seattle, DC, and San Jose to close out the season. So it is definitely not a schedule. I think most people look at it off the top and say, whoa, Seattle and Vancouver both at home 2 times. That's amazing. This is going to be great. but those are points the Timbers were getting last year anyway. They won, they won both games against Vancouver. They got a draw in one of the games against Seattle. So they took 7 of 12 from those games, points from those games last year. And I just think it is a difficult second season, difficult schedule to come back out there.
It is a difficult schedule. One thing to keep in mind with all of these is that we do know some information though about 2013, and the home and away. We know those are going to flip flop a little bit. So we do know we'll see some of that back in 2013. I'm a little curious, though, about the hosting Seattle and Vancouver, both of them twice. It just seems odd to me because the league has made a big deal about Cascadia and the passion for the game and, all the stuff they've done to sort of talk up Seattle, Vancouver, Portland. It's not like they didn't know that it's a big deal up here and that the Cascadia Cup, that people are looking forward to that. I'm surprised that knowing all of that they scheduled it the way they did.
And that the teams didn't argue. I mean, I would have.
Well, maybe they did.
But that they weren't successful. I mean, why? Right. The MLS website just ranked the Cascadia Cup as the number one thing to look forward to in 2012. Mm-hmm. That is the most interesting thing in the entire league for the entire season, in terms of rivalries, which they're supposedly now in favor of. And again, I it's good from the Timbers' perspective in some ways, but it doesn't even matter about travel. I mean, they're close enough that it's right. It's not an issue. It's not like people aren't going to get down here or get up there. But, the Timbers also play back-to-back games at Seattle or at Vancouver and at Seattle. At the end of the season, so that's kind of a crappy. There are actually 3 instances during the season. I was looking this up before I talked to John Strong last week, where there are 3 instances where back-to-back weeks one of the teams plays the other two in 2 weeks in a row, if that makes sense. So Vancouver at one point in the season plays Portland 1 week, Seattle the next. Later in the season, Seattle plays Portland 1 week, Vancouver the next. And then at the end of the season, while there is an international break in between, 2 of the last 3 games for the Timbers are at Vancouver and at Seattle, or at Seattle first, then at Vancouver, back to back. That's also not the way to foster rivalry games, because you want them. And this all goes back to the unbalanced schedule thing, and I won't go into full rant mode, but it's the value of a rivalry game in a sport that's not, say, basketball or hockey, where you play a bunch of times against your closest rivals all the time. So that's a little bit different. But in a thing like this, what makes them valuable is their scarcity, and not just. And I'm not even just talking about the 2 games as opposed to 3 games. Adding a 3rd game, it diminishes them a little bit because it throws the balance off of who had, it's not just 1 at home, 1 away. But that's palatable on some level. But to jam them back to back means that you basically take all the excitement and force them into a 2-week window, as opposed to having 1 game each month. Where maybe it's sort of the highlight of the month. Oh, we've got the Cascadia game. What's the Cascadia game this month? Mm-hmm. Oh, it's at Vancouver. Oh, it's in Seattle, whatever. You want to be able to spread those out as much as possible. I know schedule making is not something I would want to be involved in. That is not an easy process. Nobody's ever happy when schedules come out. Everybody always is upset about something, and you always screw something up. So I don't envy those people who were charged with that. But if this is your by your own admission, your highlight attraction, how could you put it in a way that is so, I mean, it's not destructive by any means, but it's just annoying. It's just not as good as it could be. And, people from the East Coast may say, well, screw you guys. There should never be this much emphasis on the West Coast anyway, because all the original teams are on the East Coast. And I get that too. Trevor says, screw you guys. So, whatever.
But yeah, it is interesting the way they scheduled the Cascadia Cup. No, we know that they put a high price on it, that they put it up on a pedestal a little bit, that they're pointing to it as something that's contributing to the momentum the league has right now and the interest in the league and whatnot. It is a little bit curious the way they scheduled it. I was a little struck looking at the schedule. The one thing that stuck out at me was in the last game of August, the first game of September, back-to-back games against the Colorado Rapids. Now, I think in terms of the entire season, the 34 games, I think these are games 25 and 26 or 26 and 27, something like that. This is right at that time of the season where you've sort of positioned yourself somewhere in the table, and now you're having to decide, are we at a spot where we have got to make a huge push to get into the playoffs like the Timbers were last year? Or are you in a spot where you're thinking, we need to consolidate our positioning. We're in a good playoff spot. We need to pick up points. We need to keep pace with the guys ahead of us. Maybe they slip and we can overtake them. But it's at that point, your season is sort of defined a little bit. You really know where you stand. And now you're hitting that home stretch, that final leg of games. And this is going to be interesting because I think people would probably guesstimate that the Timbers and the Rapids are going to be close. They certainly finished 2011 right next to each other. They could easily finish 2012 right next to each other in the standings. And they play back-to-back games there, and it's a Friday, Wednesday. It's a short turnaround. They're in Portland on Friday, and then they go to Colorado and play on a Wednesday. Back-to-back games to kick off those final 7 or 8 games of the season where you know where you stand and you know what you need. To me, that's what stuck out in the schedule is those 2 games should be really interesting against a team that is likely to be right above you or right below you in the standings.
And there's a couple of instances where that's the case, not back to back, but in close succession. And I can't find the third, but there is another one. The Timbers play in Dallas July 21st and play Dallas at home August 5th. So they're going to play. Now they do have a game in between, but that's 2 games in less than basically in 2 weeks.
It is. It's 15. Right. It's right there. It's with Chivas. They go Chivas, Dallas, Chivas, Dallas.
Oh, you're right. That's exactly it. So they play 2 games against Chivas in 10 days and 2 games against Dallas in 15 days. And then later, a month later, they play 2 games against Colorado in 5 days. And I just don't understand. Again, this is what happens when you unbalance the schedule, is that you get these screwy situations because they have so many games that they have to play against Western teams that they have to play them somewhere. Another interesting thing to point out, April 21st, Portland against Kansas City. April 28th, Portland at Montreal. May 5th, Portland against Columbus. May 15th, Portland at Houston. May 20th, Portland against Chicago. 5 straight Eastern Conference games between April 21st and 20th. They don't play another Eastern Conference team until DC Toronto or something, basically until August. We knew that the front end of the schedule was going to be filled with games against teams from the other conference. I did not expect necessarily 5 consecutive games, where basically those points matter, but they also kind of don't matter. I mean, the Timbers want to get it. The playoffs are not determined on how many points you get against only your conference opponents. It is your total league points, but you obviously need to do better against your conference opponents because that's one of those 6-point game situations. And to have 5 straight games there, that's a really weird situation. They also never play more than twice in a row at home, and they never play more than twice in a row on the road. So while in this, we can go back real quick before we run out of time here to a point that Merritt Paulson was making about mileage, and that the main reason the Timbers wanted to, or not the Timbers, MLS wanted to change the schedule was to help reduce the amount of travel, particularly for the teams in the extreme: New England, Vancouver, Seattle, Portland, New York. That now New York got the gift of a lifetime. They actually have the least amount of travel of any team in the league in 2012. They don't come to Seattle, Vancouver, or Portland in 2012. Or maybe they only come to one of them. I can't remember. But anyway, they've been reduced big time. Merritt Paulson at first said we traveled about 20,000 miles. He corrected that to about 35,000 miles, but compared to 51,000 miles in 2011. So there is a definite reduction in the amount of travel, overall travel, mainly by reducing the total number of away games against Eastern Conference teams. But that said, when you never play more than 2 away games in a row, I mean, they're home, 2 away, 2 at home, away, home, away, home, away, home, home. I mean, they are going to be bouncing back and forth. It may be a total amount, the total amount may be fewer, but they're not making less away trips. They're still playing the same number of away games. They're just doing it to closer places. They're still going to have just as many flights. They're still going to be bouncing around all over the place, particularly in July. July is outrageous. 6 games in July for the Timbers. That doesn't count a game on the last day of June. So there are 7 games between June 30th and July 28th, and they are away, home, away, home, away, away, home. So they're going to be bouncing around all over sort of the Western Conference. So anyway, that's a lot of details about the schedule that you could have also just seen yourself. But it is worth noting some of those things because for all the talk of what would be corrected by changing the schedule, it's kind of exposed the league to issues that they didn't have last year, and where people will be able to have complaints and issues and legitimate cases based on a decision that was top down, that the teams, while they ultimately assented, I can't imagine all of them wanted it, and certainly the fans don't want it. It seems I can't think of anybody that I've come across on Twitter or in person who is in favor of an unbalanced schedule. So it does set up for a difficult season for the Timbers. I mean, they are going to be in a position where they need to get as many points at home as possible again, because their away schedule is going to be really tough.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. It is going to be a challenging schedule. It'll be a tough year, and hopefully here starting on Thursday and in the next couple of weeks, we'll see some moves that will allow them to compete in that tough schedule and do some good stuff.
Yeah, I have to say really quickly, a lot of the other teams in the Western Conference have been improving their rosters. They, San Jose in particular has very much improved their roster. Seattle has augmented theirs already. We know the Galaxy are probably going to have some pretty good players back. They've a guy like Juninho is gone, so they'll be able to bring some. They've got some options for bringing new people in. Colorado's got a new coach. Possibly a change in direction there. They've been good. I mean, it's going to be as difficult as the Western Conference has been in the last few years. It's going to be, in my estimation, even tougher.
Yeah.
In 2012, and the Timbers obviously are going to be improving the roster, but at this point, we're just going to have to wait and see how once they go out there on the field against some of these teams, first in the preseason and then once the season gets going, to really get an idea of how things have sort of shaken out and who's improved more than other teams. So we shall see. In the meantime, we are going to be signing off for now, and we'll be back next Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific on the North American Soccer Network. That's 1 p.m. Eastern Time. And, of course, we will have a whole rundown of everything that happens on Thursday at the draft-related or otherwise, any other news that we get. We will be happy to chat about with you at that time. So until then, I'm Mao.
And I'm Kelly.
And we'll speak to you then.
See you next Tuesday.